The Apple Watch Series 10 is here. It has the biggest display ever. It's also the thinnest Apple Watch ever, making it even more comfortable on your wrist, whether you're running, swimming, or sleeping. And it's the fastest charging Apple Watch, getting you 8 hours of charge in just 15 minutes. The Apple Watch Series 10, available for the first time in glossy jet black aluminum. Compared to previous generations, iPhone XS or later required. Charge time and actual results will vary.
Today on CityCast Philly, you see them on your social media feeds, and you're listening to one right now. Podcasts, they're everywhere. So what's the state of podcasting here in Philly? I'm speaking with Alex Lewis, creative director and co-founder of Rowhome Productions, a Philly-based audio production agency, all about the community of creatives he's building. It's Monday, January 13th. I'm Trenae Nuri, and here's what Philly's talking about. Alex, I'm so excited that you're here because you're hosting a Philly podcast mixer with your company, Rowhome Productions, and AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. And with us, CityCast Philly, we're going to talk more about this mixer later in the show. But first, let's talk about podcasting here in Philly. What is the industry like here?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's nice to talk to you, Trenae. We've known each other for a long time, and it's an honor to finally be a guest here on CityCast Philly.
Oh, thanks.
So the state of podcasting here in Philly, well, it's a microcosm of podcasting in America, I would say. And I like looking at this number every, quarter. But I think right now in Apple Podcasts, there are over 3.2 million podcasts out there.
How many of that number are in Philly?
I was looking around for that number and I couldn't land on one that I felt confident quoting, but I would no one should necessarily cite this number, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were, over 50,000 podcasts that have been started here in Philadelphia. But yeah, among those many, many podcasts that are out there, many of them are made by independent people in their offices or in their basements or in their houses or in their garages.
Or their kitchen tables where I started podcasting.
Yes, exactly. Our public media stations here in Philadelphia all have podcasts. Our larger commercial stations here all have podcasts, from Odyssey to KYW, iHeart, etc. And again, I'm going back to public media, WHYY, WXBN, WRTI, our community media organizations in Philly like PhillyCam and Scribe have podcasts. And then, not surprisingly, most companies and nonprofit organizations are experimenting or have thriving podcasts too. Which, a short way of saying it is that everyone has a podcast. And they come in different shapes and sizes.
Sometimes it feels like there are no real rules to podcasting. How do you feel about that? Are there rules to podcasting?
No. So in my role as a longtime radio producer, podcast producer, and as the creative director of Rowhome, I give a good number of talks and lectures and teach workshops about audio making and podcasting. And the first thing I always ask a group of people is, what is a podcast? The purpose of asking that question is just to demonstrate that there isn't one definition of what a podcast is. If you ask that question to even a group of 10 people, you'll get at least, I think, 3 to 5 different definitions.
Does that make it maybe more inclusive than maybe some of the other forms of media that have been around for years?
It's definitely inclusive. Anyone can start a podcast. The barrier to entry is small. We all have microphones on our phones and our computers. The cost of getting your show distributed on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, et cetera, is, just a matter of a few dollars a month or even free per month. The main issue to me is both having conversations about podcasting. I think especially creatives or industry professionals can think they're talking about the same thing, but they can be talking about different things because podcasts can be audio only, because they can be videos, because they can be live events, because the word podcast can mean so many different things. It's important to define your terms in a given conversation sometimes. But at the same time, yeah, it's a very open, democratic, experimental medium that many people can try their hand at.
What does the workforce look like in podcasting here in Philly?
So there definitely is a professional workforce of podcasting in Philly that's growing. If you asked me that question even 5 years ago, maybe pre-COVID, that workforce was smaller, in part because the industry was is still growing and defining itself then, as it still is now. But as podcasting has become more ubiquitous, as of last year, I think something like a third of the US population listen to podcasts every week. And that number is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So here in Philly, there's the workforce that works for the public media stations. Places like WHYY now have dedicated podcast studios. Big media companies like Odyssey and Comcast have dedicated podcast producers in-house. And then many, many people work remotely these days. And so there are dozens and dozens of people in Philadelphia who are working for organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, living here in Philly. We're all sitting behind our microphones or behind our computers at our houses, so we might not know all of each other yet. But there are lots of people working in podcasting. The other thing to mention too, there are lots of independent podcast makers, obviously too, some of whom are making a good living off of it, some of whom are making a part-time living off of it, some who are just getting started or who are dreaming of making a living off it someday.
Well, I had a money question in here. Are people making money, or are they just doing this as a hobby?
Some people are making money and making a career out of it. And surely some people aren't. When so many people are making, going back to what I was saying before, like everyone is making a podcast, it's kind of a reflection of everyone. There is a certain class of people who are making a good living, have salary jobs making podcasts here in Philly. There's a very, very small number of people in Philly, and these would be mostly people who are more known names, someone like Terry Gross, who you could maybe put in the celebrity category, or Kylie Kelsey, who has the most popular podcast in America right now.
Yes.
If you mention someone like Kylie Kelsey, already a celebrity, and there are lots of celebrities, obviously, who have podcasts who are making presumably a very good living or a good supplemental to their already celebrity status living off podcasting. And then, again, going back to those independent creators out there, some of those people are making a living for sure, via something like Patreon, crowdfunding, grants from foundations, or started Kickstarter to do their podcast and are just getting off the ground.
Okay, Alex, are you trying to create a community of audio producers and enthusiasts in the city? Is that part of the reason why you're hosting this mixer?
Yes. And it's a big reason why I started Rowhome Productions with the other co-founder, John Myers. For over a decade, I was an independent radio producer. I made radio stories and radio documentaries for the public media outlets in town, for nonprofit organizations that had their own independent podcasts in the city, and also made audio pieces and stories for National Public Radio, Marketplace, and other radio programs around the country and around the world. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, Trenae, but a very famous show called Serial came out. I believe that was in 2012, 2013. And that really changed the direction of my career. Just in that all of a sudden, Serial was this smash hit, serialized true crime series that came out via This American Life. And all of a sudden, people had podcasts, knew how to listen to podcasts on their phone and wanted more. And so I went from calling myself an independent radio producer to calling myself an independent radio and podcast producer, because so many podcasts were popping up. And so for a producer like me, someone who knew how to interview people, use recording equipment, put it all together, there was just more and more opportunity. And then fast forward to around 2017, 2018, which I think a lot of people these days are calling sort of like a peak golden age of podcasting, when every big company, private equity was getting just dumped into creating more and more podcasts. Famously, Spotify invested over $1 billion in podcasts, buying podcast network Gimlet and Joe Rogan too. And so it was around this time, all these podcasts were popping up. There's all this money in podcasting. But one thing I noticed was that energy wasn't quite the same here in Philadelphia. Like, all these podcast companies were popping up in New York or in Chicago or in LA or in DC. And I just asked myself the question of like, why not here in Philadelphia? We're one of the biggest cities in the country, in my opinion, the coolest city in the country. Why aren't we harnessing more of the podcast energy here in the city? And so I went to my friend, John Myers, who at the time was a producer at World Cafe, a national public radio show out of WXBN. And he agreed. And we're like, what if we just put up our little shingle here in Philadelphia, our own little podcast production company, both to help people, creative people, companies, organizations, public media organizations create more podcasts, create hopefully better sounding podcasts, but also just to help nurture the culture of audio making and radio making and podcast making here in Philly, just through having casual gatherings, listening sessions. I have aspirations someday for having maybe a small festival, hosting more speakers and other audio makers from around the world and around the country here in the city. So yeah, the long answer to your question is like something like doing this like Philly podcast mixer, which this will be the fourth one I think we've done in the past few years, is just a small piece of the puzzle of hopefully creating a bigger and better audio culture here in Philly.
You got me thinking. The wheels in my head are turning, Alex. What an amazing story you just shared. And I'm wondering, when it comes to the culture of podcasting, who is driving that? Is it, the Kylie Kelseys, the $1 million worth of game with Wallow and Gilly the Kid? Or is it the independent podcasts that are talking about relationships and sex? Or, our local DJs who are hosting sets, and the comedians and the journalists in the city? Like, who is driving that culture? Or is it all of us that are driving the culture?
I think it's the last thing you said. I think it's all of us that's driving the culture. It's why it's actually one of my favorite questions to ask a group of people is, what podcasts are you listening to? What are your favorite podcasts? Because what I find, I would say 95% of the time, is that maybe people have some common ground among those very, very popular podcasts that are out there. But almost always people say one podcast I've never heard of before that reflect some passion they have, some interest that they have. The basket weaving podcast, the English Premier League podcast. And so I think what's really driving the culture is just the popularity in the portable format of podcasting in general. And whether it is the RSS feeds on our phone via Apple Podcasts and Spotify, however you listen on your phone, and increasingly on YouTube, increasingly on TikTok and Instagram, what people are calling podcasts too. I think it really is just the ubiquity of people listening to what they call podcasts is what's driving the culture more than any one particular podcast itself.
Let's continue this conversation about the state of podcasting in Philly after the break.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Build a routine with Ollie that supports your wellness needs. like getting your daily vitamins and minerals with Ollie's multi-gummies, or keeping your mood upbeat with all the vitamin D in Hello Happy. Give your gut health some support with probiotics, and wake up feeling refreshed after taking Ollie Sleep. Do wellness on your terms. Find Ollie at a Walmart or Target near you or at ollie.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
I want to talk about content. Philly, we have a kind of a stereotype. We are a sports city, and we are in some respects, right?
Sure.
So there are lots of sport-related radio shows and content out there. And also we just have a thriving food scene. So there's a podcast called Delicious City Philly. Is there a particular subject matter or content or conversations that you feel like are common amongst Philadelphians?
I mean, there are definitely lots of Eagles podcasts. If you do a quick Google search of most popular podcasts, Philadelphia, and again, I would say it's hard for me to know the exact metrics that people are using around these things. But if you do any search around that, I'd say in the top 20 things you see, there'll be at least maybe a quarter of those that are related to the Eagles or the Phillies. Sports podcasts are just generally very, very popular. There are lots of podcasts seemingly around arts and culture in the city. There's a podcast called Streets Department, which is hosted by Conrad Benner, which I think in a way that to me is one of the podcasts kind of it's a really good reflection of maybe Philadelphia culture. And then in podcasting in general, Conrad is this longtime lover and guide to Philly public art, to Philly street art. And he's also an influencer with lots of followers on Instagram. I would love to hear about true crime shows that are made by people here in Philly that people are listening to. That is the most popular genre of podcast, I think. And there's just a slew of interview shows.
With all of these types of podcasts out there and this growing community, or this community that you're trying to actually connect and kind of get us all together, what else is missing in this conversation? What do podcasters need?
In general, and here in Philadelphia, the two obvious things that podcasters need is easy access to training and funding, to be frank.
Yeah.
At Rowhome Productions, this is the inquiry we get the most. Someone from a company or a nonprofit organization or individual reaches out saying, I have this really great idea for a show, or I have this podcast project I really want to pursue, but I don't know what gear to get. I don't know what microphone to use. I don't know how to learn how to use the audio editing software. I don't know how to write a script. I don't know how to structure the story yet. And just access to that training. There are places like Scribe Video Center in West Philly sometimes offer classes, or Philly Cam, and other workshops pop up. But one thing I would love to see in Philadelphia is just more consistent offerings for kind of learning the craft of podcast making, audio storytelling in general. And to address the second one, funding. As I said earlier, the barrier to entry of starting to make a podcast isn't necessarily expensive. Again, we all have microphones available to us on our phones and our computers. There is free audio editing software out there. There are resources you can find online. But I'd say particularly for people who, obviously if you're trying to make a living from making podcasts, you need to get paid. But, for these kinds of series that a lot of us love, these like limited run series, true crime series, documentary series, audio fiction, it's not necessarily cheap to make that kind of work.
Yes.
It's time intensive. It's resource intensive. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you need to travel places. It's like writing your great novel or book. You need time.
Do you think that labor kind of sets people back? Like, oh, I actually didn't realize that, putting a podcast together does take some producing, some behind the scenes producing that I didn't know I needed.
Definitely. One negative side effect of people both watching people on social media make podcasts, I think kind of the popularity of the video podcast, and also just generally the sheen, as they should be, the nice sheen of good podcasts can make it seem like making a great podcast is easy to people. They're like, oh, all I need to do is set up 2 microphones and have conversations with my friends or with other kinds of guests. And, I'm an interesting person. I'm a good conversationalist.
I hear that all the time.
It's true. But I think in a way, it's a testament to how good you are at your job and how good, the best podcasts are at creating shows, is that it makes it seem like it's really easy to people, when in fact, and as you well know, a lot goes on behind the scenes to make a podcast good and something that people want to listen to. There's the interview preparation, there's knowing how the equipment works, and then all the editing that happens behind the scenes and structuring to make something sound great. And so I think a lot of people get the idea that's easy, have an idea, and then, they sit down and they're like, oh, whoops, this is actually a little bit more difficult than I thought.
What do you think podcasting looks like this year and maybe in the next coming years in Philly? Does the industry grow, thrive, change?
It's definitely changing. And just to mention sort of like the national story around podcasting last year, as it has been for the past couple years, has been a downsizing in sort of like the major, big, hugely funded podcast industry. Places like Vox Media laid off a good number of its podcast employees. Public media stations like WNYC, WBZ in Chicago have downsized their podcast operations. I would argue that there was perhaps an over-investment in podcasts from private investors, that, that it was going to be really hard to make all that money back. And podcasting was going to have to find another, perhaps more realistic way forward. That said, even though there's been this downsizing and kind of like the huge podcast investment that we've seen over the last decade, as I mentioned earlier, podcasts are more popular than ever. And so people are going to keep making them, are going to keep innovating in the podcast space. I think the big story we've seen early this year so far is about the famous pivot to video that we've heard about before, but where people who have previously made audio only podcasts, or companies and organizations and people who are launching new podcasts, are going to be strongly considering having video be a big part of it. Whether it is just releasing the conversations as they are in the audio feed onto YouTube, onto social media, or just having a bigger social media presence. And obviously, like all the major social media platforms are visual in nature. But I also predict that, we'll continue to see public media innovating in podcasting as, public radio needs to evolve with newer and younger audiences. I think we'll continue to see major media companies innovating and creating new podcasts. So it's all to say, I think podcasting is definitely here to stay. I think there's lots of experimenting to do in this space. And I don't know, I remain optimistic and very excited about new shows and podcasting in general.
I wonder if you can address this question. And this is, I'm taking it back to when I was introduced to podcasting, or the idea of podcasting. This is back in like 2017. Sometimes, there's a perception that like a certain podcasting community could be pretentious, or like, I don't know everything about everything, so I'm not sure if this community is for me. So can you tell me a little bit about just like the community of podcasters here in Philly? How can you take a bunch of creatives that have different perspectives on Philly, different vantage points of Philly, different interests, and put them all together in a room to talk about the same thing we're all trying to make?
That is a really good question. I find myself coming back to the idea that everyone is making podcasts. And so on one hand, I think there's a lot of common ground between people who are making podcasts in general. We're all media makers. We're all creatives at some level. So whether it's, finding that common ground through talking about the craft and, talking about how to have a great interview, how to make something sound really good, what new software and technology is out there to help you make your show, talking about microphones, talking about all of that. I think that's common ground. But I think it's also for anyone's listening who is maybe in that same position and it's like, well, how do I find my place in the kind of local media landscape? I think it is also about finding people who share your similar interests. If you're someone who's trying to make, food related content, restaurant related content in Philadelphia, connect with other people who are doing, there's lots of people who have food podcasts, food Substacks, food social media accounts. Again, I think the beauty of podcasting is that people are making shows about everything. And so there are all these different niche communities within podcasting that people can connect with.
Thursday's the big event. What can people expect at the podcast mixer on January 16th at Solar Myth on Broad Street?
Yeah, well, so first off, Solar Myth is a very, very cool venue and bar. If you had been to Boot and Saddle before, that's where it is. It's called Solar Myth now. It's run by an organization called Ars Nova Workshop. They typically have jazz and experimental music shows there, but they are very nicely opening the doors up to our community of audio makers and podcasters. The people coming are mostly other podcasters and radio makers and audio makers and journalists here in the city. Mostly people who are interested or already create podcasts. And then the featured event that night, Trenae will be hosting a panel with three people. One journalist and longtime radio producer, Yowei Shaw, who might be most well known for being the co-host and then host of NPR's Invisibilia, which unfortunately ended last year. She has a new show called Proxy. Lauren Passell, she's kind of considered a podcast marketing audience growth guru. Her company's called Tink Media. She just moved here to Philly. It's very exciting to have her in town. And just sidebar, the one question that we always get is, how do I grow the audience for my show? Ask Lauren. She's the person to ask about that. And then the third and final person on the panel is Tom Grassler. He is the head of WHYY's digital studios. He's both in charge of creating sort of YouTube content for WHYY, but also podcasts. One show that we collaborate on with WHYY here at Rowhome is called Art Outside, which is also with aforementioned Conrad Benner. But he's the one innovating in the podcast space at WHYY. So we have the public media perspective, the independent creator perspective, and the audience growth marketing perspective, and all being ushered by you, Trenae.
Oh, well, I am so excited to meet everybody. I'm getting some new friends at the top of the year. So some years ago, there was an annual podcast festival here in Philly. Alex Lewis, are you bringing back a Philly podcast festival of sorts?
I can't promise it yet, but that is absolutely, I've heard that the folks who organized that previous Philly Podcast Festival are trying to bring it back, hopefully this year in 2025. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there is infinite space for podcast energy here in Philadelphia. You know, if there was a podcast festival every weekend, I would be happy about it. I think there'd be enough people.
Oh my gosh, I'll be so tired.
Better be tired than bored, you know?
Right. Alex Lewis, creative director and co-founder of Rowhome Productions. Thank you so much for joining me on CityCast Philly today.
Thank you for having me.
Come join Alex and the CityCast Philly team and I at Solar Myth this Thursday, January 16th at 6 p.m. And guess what? It's free! That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this episode about podcasting in Philly, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye. All the sounds of Philadelphia, babies crying, dogs barking, police sirens.
Yes.
We get it all.